Growers who are looking for that secret sauce usually are just missing something from their garden. And to help with that, we bring you the Stash Blend Premium Plant Additive. Stash Blend brings beneficial bacteria, silicon, seaweed, humic acid, and has enough macronutrition to help lower the dosages of your base feed too. Unleash your plant's true potential with Stash Blend Premium Plant Additive. Available at Growers House. This episode is brought to you by AC Infinity. The Ion Beam Kit is AC Infinity's full spectrum LED bar lighting. This kit includes a lighting controller, 4 LED grow light bars, and 4 steel bars that allow for flexible mounting on any part of the grow tent. Its unibody housing and aluminum board feature full spectrum Samsung LM301H white LEDs. And the beauty of it is you can integrate this with all of the AC Infinity products in your garden. And if for some reason you don't already have the Controller 6.9 Pro, well, this kit includes an innovative controller that features 4 brightness intensity levels and 4 daily timer settings. This LED is not only efficient, but very affordable, especially when using that discount code, the Stash15 at checkout.
What's up?
Hey, boys.
Back.
Good to
Back
see
at
you.
it.
Back again, like rent on the 1st.
Yeah.
We got a guest.
You
We
paid
got
your
a
rent on
guest here.
time? Oh, I guess. Oh, Nick. Hi.
Hey guys,
How
how's it
you
going?
doing, man? Thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely, man.
Yeah, so you were on my Garden Talk podcast, so you're a familiar face for some of the folks that have tuned into my content. We had a great episode on carbon dioxide, right, CO2, and it really blew a lot of people's minds. We got into biochemistry and really went down a deep, deep rabbit hole there. And having you on from the stash, man, I'm really excited about this one because now this audience is going to be exposed to this. And we're going to talk about a little something different, right? It's not just going to be CO2. Maybe there's CO2 that's going to be spoken about, but plant nutrition in general. I think that's a great topic. You have a lot of knowledge on. I mean, I'll let you tell us a little bit about yourself, but Rooted Leaf is a company that you have, nutrients. So yeah, why don't we start there? Why don't you kind of tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Hey everyone, my name is Nick. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Rooted Leaf Agritech. We're a manufacturing company based here in Washington State, and we make a line of carbon-based fertilizers that are useful for all plants, any crop that you can possibly grow, whether it's tomatoes and cucumbers all the way to hops and aromatic flowers and things like that. The idea that we had when we started this company was that carbon really is a macronutrient for all crops. I mean, the function of how plants grow is ultimately defined by this pursuit of capturing carbon, of storing carbon and moving it around and expressing it in so many different ways. So all of the pigments, all of the flavors, all of the colors, aromas, and therapeutic effects that any plant on earth can possibly provide or create is going to be a function of how much carbon that plant gets. So for me, a few years ago, when we first entered the space, it was really intriguing to me to look out at the landscape of fertilizer options in general and kind of see the same stuff, more or less, just rebranded and repackaged. All of the formulations are more or less the same, and they don't really get to the heart of what plants are actually trying to do. Plants are in this process of capturing light energy and using it to suck CO2 out of the air. So we'll kind of get into the dynamics of that a little bit, but I think it's helpful for people to understand the larger context overall is that an easy way to understand nutritional elements like the nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, an easy way to understand that is to always keep in mind that the reason plants are using these elements ultimately has something to do with carbon. Somewhere along the step in the process or somewhere in the chain, either at the beginning or at the very end, carbon is going to come in and be factored in as the major important thing that plants are trying to access and capture. So, we started down this pathway a few years ago, and ever since 2019, we've been manufacturing this full line, and we've seen some phenomenal results all around. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about some of the nutritional elements, how plants are utilizing them, and really what is the purpose of these elements, and how can growers, when they go back into their gardens, better connect with their plants, whether they're growing food crops or medicinal crops.
Nick, that's so exciting. How does one get so excited or in tuned with this, with the importance of carbon within the development of the plant? Where does your plant enthusiasm come from?
Well, I have a background in chemistry, more industrial chemistry at first. About 10 or 15 years ago, I was, I had a kombucha company, so I was brewing out my own teas and I was making kombucha. And that was really kind of an aha moment for me, because I realized that you can get such a drastically different expression in your kombucha if you just change the type of tea that you use and you change the type of sugar that you use. So Yeah,
I'm sorry.
kombucha.
What is it? Kombucha? It's a tea.
Kombucha is a fermented tea. So they basically take like a green tea or a black tea. They add a little bit of sugar into that, make a liquid extract or a liquid solution, and then they inoculate it with a particular blend of microbes and yeast. And this co-culture of bacteria and yeast, it's a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. They will break down the constituents of the tea, so all the flavonoids, all of the organic acids, all the amino acids, things like that are soluble. They start to break them down and they start to convert them. So you end up with a fizzy beverage. It's probiotic. It's really good for your digestive system. The microbes that tend to be cultured in kombucha are very healthy for the human gut anyways. It's like we've got our own little microbiome, very analogous to the rhizosphere in plants. Plants depend on beneficial microbes to help break down nutritional substances and release them to plants. Well, the same thing is actually true of humans too. We depend on microbes being inside of our gut because those microbes are the ones with the enzymes and the tools to help break down the complex stuff that then becomes nutrition for us. And if you don't have healthy microbial populations in your gut, you can start to get things like irritable bowel syndrome. And, I'm not a doctor, I'm not offering any medical advice, but there's definitely a correlation between what is going on in your gut microbiome and what is going on in the rest of your body at large, brain chemistry included, nervous system chemistry, pretty much everything that you do as a human can be informed by the activities of microbes in your gut. So when I first started brewing kombucha, all the other stuff was more or less the same. There's big brands out there, they use black tea and they use cane sugar, but I inadvertently stumbled across using a very particular type of oolong tea, and I fermented it with honey. So instead of a black tea, I used oolong tea, and instead of cane sugar, I used honey. And the very first time I brewed that, it just opened up this whole new world of possibilities for me, and that was like the infinite source of inspiration. Every sip that I took, I was like, how is this even possible? This like crazy complex flavor profile, a very long enduring aftertaste that lasts for like an hour, and it tastes like honey and it tastes like peaches. It's the most insane thing. So I was like, yeah, there's something going on here with the way these microbes are transforming these particular food sources. So that was kind of my foray into fermentation chemistry. And then around 2014, I got hired on at a chemical manufacturing plant. They brought me in to do a little bit of reformulation work. They were making things like, soaps and degreasers and more industrial chemicals. So that was my opportunity to kind of get involved on the industrial chemistry side. I was making surfactants and things of that nature. And then here in Washington State, right around 2015, I decided to get into a slightly different side of the chemical manufacturing industry. I started to go into plant nutrition and plant fertilizer. I've always been passionate about plants and how they grow ever since I was a young child. My parents, had gardens in the backyard, and we would, grow tomatoes and cucumbers and things like that. So I've always been connected with plants. But, at that time, back in 2015, it seemed really appropriate for me to kind of dovetail my personal passions and interests along with my professional experience. And that's how this idea of a fertilizer line was born. And then from there, it was just a matter of perspective. It's not so much what you're looking at, it's how you're looking at it. And I think, this kind of fits into the larger narrative of how the human body of knowledge associated with how plants grow really has changed remarkably, even over the past 20, 30 years. The things that people used to think 50 years ago, it's not that they're not applicable nowadays. It's that we've come so far and we've learned so much that the landscape of potential is totally different. We now can see very minute, very nuanced things happening inside of plants that 50 years ago we just didn't have the technology to see. And what this meant for me was that there was a time to kind of merge the two industries of botany and exploring how plants do what they do with fertilizer science. And the problem is that there's no congruency between the two of them. We're using fertilizer technologies that are vastly outdated. Most of the fertilizer technologies are based on ideas that came forward in the 1950s and the 1960s. And you wouldn't drive a car from the 1950s or 1960s. I mean, maybe you would. It might be like a classic or a collector car. But, people by and large don't use phones from the 50s and 60s.
I wouldn't rely on auto science from the 50s and 60s.
Yeah,
That's for sure. Yeah.
And so this body of knowledge that we have built up around how plants are doing their things has not matched the fertilizer technologies that are capable of delivering nutrients to plants. And I thought about this for a while, and I kind of went down this path of, trial and error, testing it on plants and seeing how the plants would respond. And it very quickly became apparent to me that there's definitely something missing from most fertilizer solutions. And that's something I later realized was carbon. There's very, very few, if any, carbon-based fertilizers out there. We're one of the only, if not the only one, that is making a true carbon-based fertilizer product line, and that goes directly into the plants, and it's capable of supporting any kind of biosynthetic activity that they want, whether it's colors and flavors and aromas, even nutrient density in tomatoes and cucumbers. I mean, you can get much healthier food overall as a result of using carbon-based fertilizers.
Well, it makes sense. Like less waste. I think the biggest thing is I say this all the time with a lot of things, is people don't reinvent the wheel. Oftentimes they'll just follow potentially a bad SOP. You look at commercial grows from here. I live in Michigan. Chris is in Vegas, and Pigeons is in Canada. Pretty comparable grow setups, and usually it was one or two consultants who just spread this around. And I think it's comparable with nutrients. Someone sees what someone else does, they find a way to get a better ROI, or less bottles or more bottles, and they move forward. They don't look at a new way to do it. And it's funny enough, I had someone years ago bring up saying that, like, the future is carbon-based nutrients, not mineral-based, you need carbon-based. I'm like, I don't even know what that means. And it's great that now we're talking about this more, because I feel like, kind of like, with gut health, the root health is similar, and like the rhizosphere is similar to where it connects to all these other things. And by giving the food directly to it, that's where the argument of organic soil, where it's nutrient enriched, and you're bypassing a lot of the extra crap that is in a bottle. With carbon based, it's like you purified it, and now you're giving it more giving plant what it wants. It's like Brondo, idiocracy stuff.
Yeah, and the thing about carbon that's really unique is it's capable of taking on so many different shapes and configurations that it's hard to like pinpoint a carbon deficiency. If we're talking about nitrogen, for example, it's easy for us to look at a leaf and say, well, that leaf is yellow, and that yellowing could be the result of a nitrogen deficiency. But how do you look at your plants and say, well, that's deficient in carbon? Maybe it's not quite as aromatic as it could be. Maybe the concentration of terpenes or flavonoids or active constituents isn't as high as it could be. And in reality, all of those compounds are a reflection of the carbon status of the plant. And I'll give you a good example of that. All of the monoterpenes that are out there, like when you walk through a pine forest early on in the morning and you get that whiff or that breeze of, fresh pine, woodsy kind of a smell. Well, the trees are producing alpha pinene and they're producing beta pinene. And if you look at the molecular formula for those compounds, they happen to be 90% carbon by weight. So if you want more of those substances that are mostly carbon by weight, it kind of makes sense to start factoring carbon as an element into the nutritional program. Now, having said that, because there's so many different there's hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of different possible shapes and configurations that these carbon-based molecules are capable of taking. So it's really difficult for us to pinpoint what exactly plants may be deficient in, or what they could be better suited to express. So not all forms of carbon are the same. There's a difference between biochar and humic substances with some of the types of carbon that we're working with, which is like the low molecular weight organic acid fractions. If you look kind of a top-down overview of plant metabolism at large, effectively what plants are trying to do is capture carbon and to store it in a variety of different ways, and then use that stored carbon, fixed pool of carbon, as fuel that they can burn for pathways that they need to feed. Some of these pathways produce volatile substances, aromatic substances, even colors like pigments, for example. So there's this pool of available building blocks, so to speak, that the plants are capable of pulling from. And the faster they deplete that available pool, the less likely they are to actually continue synthesizing those compounds. So the enzymes become less active because they don't have any substrates. There's nothing for them to act on or to work on. This is why in a lot of instances you might find, certain plants are grown indoors in a sealed flowering room, and that sealed environment allows growers to crank up the CO2 gas. And they notice that when you crank up the CO2 gas, you get a better productivity out of those plants. You get a higher yield and a higher concentration of the compounds that you want. It has everything to do with the carbon that's in the air. So imagine being able to put carbon in the feed water rather than in the air. This kind of changes the dynamics of the system. You're no longer loading the carbon from the outside in and relying on a sealed room, but rather you're putting that carbon inside of the actual water that's then taken up by the plants and utilized from the inside out. So now you can do things like focus a little bit more on airflow. Maybe you don't need such expensive equipment like so many air conditioners and dehumidifiers. Running the system itself to get high levels of productivity and high yield and high quality becomes less expensive overall. And I think that's what the industry in general kind of needs. Agriculture in general needs more sustainable solutions, regardless of what it is that we're growing. But there's so many different crops that, this carbon-based technology is applicable to, and it just can benefit everyone from, whether they're growing outdoors or whether they're growing in a sealed flowering room. Outdoors, you can't change the concentration of CO2 in the air. It kind of is what it is. And it's really hard to artificially increase that. So a lot of strategies that revolve around how to get better productivity out of outdoor crops revolve around taking care of the soil and the soil health, because the soil itself is like a sink for carbon that the plants ultimately end up feeding. And then that carbon gets fed right back to them as a result of the microbial and fungal activities.
Pretty
Yeah,
fascinating, man. Like,
dude,
we're only
it
12
is.
minutes in, and it's so eye-opening.
Well, it makes you think, like, this is where in the the concentration amount of, let's say, the liquid-based nutrients that people are feeding, when you're looking at carbon-based nutrients, would it still be similar dosages looking at in terms of, let's say, the ratios that you're feeding your plants, or would it's more concentrated because it's more purified in terms of being carbon-based instead of the latter?
Yeah, and I think a good way to create the analogy is to equate the amount of carbon that's dissolved in feed water with CO2 that's in the air, because that's the most ubiquitous form. So most growers will know their CO2 levels. Maybe it's 1,000 ppm, maybe it's 1,500 ppm. I can't speak for other carbon-based fertilizer lines, but I can tell you that our products the full line is capable of delivering approximately 4,000 ppms of CO2 equivalent carbon, and that does not require any kind of sealed flowering room. In fact, you can have less than ambient CO2 concentrations and still get amazing results. And for a very long time, we were trying to figure out how exactly this is possible, how it's working with the plants, because the idea effectively is that plants are in the business of taking CO2 out of the air. So what's the mechanism by which they're capable of taking it up through the feed water and then acting on that carbon instead of the one that's in the air? And I think once we started to peel back the layers of biochemistry, what's actually happening inside of these plants, it became apparent to me that it's not a direct transfer of CO2 from the outside air into the active site of Rubisco, which is the enzyme that effectively takes CO2 out of there and makes the sugars with it. That's like the transformation that occurs. Rubisco is fed a pool of available carbon within the plants that plants are trying to create an equilibrium and establish a baseline so that they're always in balance. They can always keep this engine operating without ever worrying about running out of fuel or running out of substrate. It's a very complex process, but ultimately the idea is that CO2 delivery to the plants is less effective overall than putting soluble carbon in the water and having plants take that up. There's certain rates of turnover with CO2 in the air. Rubisco, that enzyme that I mentioned, is capable of taking CO2 out of the air, but it does so very slowly. The turnover rate for that engine is approximately every 3 seconds to every 10 seconds, it'll turn over once, which means it fires and it reacts once. That's very, very slow when you compare that turnover rate to how fast is the light energy coming in. I mean, it's quite literally coming in at the speed of light. So plants are faced with this influx of solar irradiation, this energy coming in, and they have to figure out what to do with that energy. And in an ideal circumstance, all of the energy that's generated from the power of the sun is going to get funneled into this carbon fixation process. Plants are really trying to power that process more than anything. But it's inherently limited because of this turnover rate is very, very slow. So you have this buildup of stuff that supports the activities of Rubisco, and then you have Rubisco firing. And once it fires, it moves the carbon, and then the substrate pool continues to get built up. So it's almost like we're taking a little bit of a shortcut, if you will. We're no longer depending on the activities of this slow engine enzyme to turn over and to take CO2 out of there every 3 to 10 seconds. Instead, we're delivering it to the plants as fast as the plants are capable of taking up water. So now you can start to focus on things like maybe having your plants drink a little bit faster, because if they drink faster, they'll take up more water, they'll take up more dissolved nutrition, and they'll take up more carbon, which means they can act on that carbon as a substrate with less turnaround time between it being CO2 and it being something useful and relevant to, the synthesis of compounds within the plant.
Well, it's like this is where the high frequency fertigation techniques would thrive, because then again, you're not having to rely on third party equipment. You're putting it direct to the plant. And if you're doing something like a high EC, frequent feeding, and it's carbon based, it seems like a no brainer where you may be spending as much on your nutrients there, but you're getting more without the external addition. And then, there's always the environmental impact of the artificial CO2 that we're putting in the air that the plants aren't taking. Now we're just bypassing that and pushing it right into the plants. And I think that's really useful for a lot of people, especially in a commercial grow setting. When you're looking at, 30,000 square feet and you're having to have CO2 for that whole space, it's difficult. But then also a lot of them are running high pressure sodium lighting, HID lighting. So to be able to have your plants, maximize what they can take by giving them that carbon direct, and then now they can handle that environment easier and you don't have to supplement all the other air conditionings and things you were talking about earlier, that's going to be a game changer. I think it's just the fact that a lot of the science is over the head of a lot of people, and it's easy to go in with the SOP from Athena or from a Quick Brand and be like, just follow this, your COAs will go up. It's like, well, the way you broke it down is great, because now you're explaining, just bypass all this extra stuff, skip all the extra steps of having your plants work more and work for your plant and let it get better results.
Yeah, and one of the distinct advantages too is that we're capable of tying the carbon load directly in with the macronutrient load. So a lot of times if you're in a sealed room, you may have a couple of different variables that operate independently. You've got your light intensity, you can turn that up or you can turn it down. You've got your CO2 concentrations, you can open the valve a little more or you can close it. And then you have the strength of the feed water itself. So how much nutrition are you actually dissolving? How much EC are you feeding your plants? Those three are just like a car engine, because a car engine, in order to produce torque and horsepower, you need spark, you need air, and you need fuel. Those are like the core components of what makes an engine do its thing. Now, obviously, when we're talking about plants, it's not horsepower and torque. It may be terpenes and other flavonoids, compounds that we're looking for. The production of those compounds is still going to rely on spark, air, and fuel. But the spark is the light intensity. The air is obviously the concentration of CO2. And then the fuel is all the water that they're pulling up with the dissolved nutrition inside of it. So as a grower, most of the time what happens is when you increase the light intensity, you also have to increase the CO2 and you have to increase the strength of the feed water. Because if you increase the strength of the feed water without turning up the light intensity, you could run into a situation where maybe you've over-fertilized the plants and they start to develop toxicities, they start to get burned. So if you're in a situation where maybe you feel like you fed a little bit too heavy, it may seem counterintuitive, but the best thing that you can do to prevent your plants from burning is crank up the CO2 concentration and crank up the light intensity a little bit. Because as those inputs come in, you've got the spark, you've got the air, and you've got the fuel, and plants will create an equilibrium. Now, the benefit of having carbon dissolved in the feed water is that we're inherently connecting the two together so that the amount of carbon and the amount of dissolved minerals is matched perfectly. So when you introduce a higher EC load to your plants, they're going to be fully buffered out. They will not burn nearly as easily. I'll give you a good example. Nitrates are a good example because nitrates are very common in the cultivation of pretty much every crop. But excessive nitrates can have some detrimental effects to the plants overall. Well, what ends up happening is that when the plants are taking in that light energy, they're generating something called reduction power. And really what they're trying to do is reduce carbon out of the air, because CO2 in the air has that oxygen. The oxygen is useless for plants. They don't really care about it. They want that carbon, and they need to expend energy to break that carbon away from the oxygen. They could care less about the oxygen. They're capable of producing oxygen just as a byproduct of their natural photosynthesis. So the power of the sun comes in to fuel this process of taking the oxygen off of the carbon. The same thing is true of nitrates, actually, because nitrates are NO3, and it has the same problem as CO2. They both have oxygens. So now instead of the reduction power being funneled towards carbon reduction, they're funneling that reduction power towards nitrate reduction. And this is why feeding excessive nitrates through the mid to late stages of flowering can actually have a massive impact on overall quality and yield, because there's such an energy draw away from the plants. They want to feed the carbon reduction pathway. They want to make those terpenes. They want to make those flavonoids. They want to make all these wonderful pigments and aromas and colors. But instead, under a high nitrate load, they have to divert most of that power away and move it towards nitrate reduction. Now, the benefit of having a carbon-based fertilizer line is that we have reduced carbon that the plants can access, and that reduced carbon is actually an energy source that allows them to convert the nitrate without diverting power away from what's coming in through the leaf surface. So you can still have the light intensity powering this process of CO2 fixation without worrying how much of that power gets split off and goes towards nitrate reduction. So that's why it's useful to have chemically reduced forms of carbon, because they represent stored pools of energy, and that energy can be tapped into and accessed to then be spent on energy intensive processes like the reduction of nitrates. Nitrate reduction is extremely energy intensive for the plants. About 25% of all of the energy that the plants actually take in can go towards nitrate reduction. But on the flip side of that equation, nitrogen only makes up 1 to 3, maybe 3 to 5% of the total composition of the plant. So think about this. You're trading 25% of all of the energy your plants will take in for something that only makes up 1 to 3, maybe 3 to 5% of the biomass. That's a huge amount of energy. And as growers, I think we need to be mindful about that energy intensive process, because really what we need to do in our gardens is gear the plants for reducing carbon, less for reducing nitrogen. This is where forms like amino acids come in, because they represent an energy savings. The plant doesn't have to reduce the nitrate into an ammoniacal form because there's already an amino acid. That work's already been done. That energy is already stored in that group, in that molecule. So, yeah.
I think that's where a lot of people are focused on growing almost more plant material. It seems yield, and they're not thinking growing more cannabinoids. Mm-hmm. And I think the result of having a nutrient that's focused on letting the plant develop properly would maybe change that for more people. And even if they wanted to push the crop to still get the heavy yield in terms of flower, the future is cannabinoids. I still smoke, blunts allegedly. And it's probably the old school, most worst method. It's probably the one vice I could kick sooner than later. But it's really something that the future is extraction. It is purity. It is cleanliness with your consumption. And having a carbon-based nutrient, clearly, it's gotten me thinking so much more, because I still have half my garden is synthetic, bottle-based, we'll say. And the other half is super soil. And I'm like, I'm going to need a change.
So it sounds fantastic, right? Get the carbon from the soil, don't have to rely on it from the air, don't have to get spend money on supplementing CO2. I like to stir the pot a little bit, if I may.
Okay.
We got a lot of folks that grow organic, right? And I'm looking at Rooted Leaf and I see a bunch of bottles here. A lot of people automatically assume bottled synthetic, right? Harmful to the environment. So let me ask you this. Can this work in an organic system? And also, is this going to be bad for the environment, the way that these nutrients are created because it's in bottles like this, or how does that all factor into it?
So it definitely plays very nice with any kind of organic system. If you have a fully amended living soil, we have a light feed chart that is specifically intended for that application. The product line itself, there's basically two halves to what we do. One is the advanced chemistry side, where we're taking a look at carbon and its various oxidation states and kind of the reduction power that's baked in, all this very advanced scientific stuff. And then on the flip side, the other half of our products is actually plant extracts. We do a lot of fermentation chemistry. We work with several dozen species of plants. And really what we're trying to do is find valuable compounds in those plants that might be useful for us to either support really healthy living soil chemistries or directly participate in with plants and their primary metabolic pathways. So if we can do things like increase the breadth and the depth of the terpene profile and the overall concentration of maybe minor cannabinoids that are present inside of these plants. That's really what we want to see when we're working with some of these plants. So as far as the applicability goes, yes, they're definitely applicable in any kind of living soil, any kind of organic application. Most of the people that run heavily amended living soils that use our products, they don't really use too much primer A and B. Those are really more intended for inert media, for rock wool, for hydroponic grows, things like that. But really the rest of the products, the additives, are very, very good for living soil. And as far as the impact on the environment, because we're going through fermentation chemistry to produce a lot of the compounds, it's significantly less harmful for the environment. The plastic bottles that we source, they are recyclable and they're manufactured here domestically. So they have less of an environmental impact overall. But, still when people are looking for things that are the most sustainable that's possible to achieve in a bottled format, I would say that our products are definitely up there.
Very exciting. I'm glad to hear that.
I appreciate you expanding on that. There's so many companies out there that, they're just filling it up with as much water as they possibly can, and they're really trying to get their increase their margins as much as possible, and they don't care about the environment. They're
no longevity, sustainability.
Yeah, they have people outdoors using them, and they're over fertilizing, and it's runoffs going to lake and streams. Toxic algae blooms are happening, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, that's one thing I think a lot of us really encourage is sustainability and making sure that we're doing things right for the environment. So, it's good to hear that that's within your business model there.
Yeah, we can't teach this many people to grow without having some it's like we're spreading more and more hey, grow, get lights, do this. And it's whoa, we got to make sure all these people growing now, we got to think about the footprint we're having now. So I really like the thought of sustainability with that, because there's a lot of bottles. I'm the Mr. Not carry so many bottles, but I like the fact that you have the thought process of different charts for different applications. That's what makes it approachable for people versus you need the whole kit. A lot of things are like a key. I don't want to throw names out, but the other 9 bottle brands, you need every bottle to get the dank. Otherwise it's fair. It grows, but this is nice that you break it down in terms of what you need specifically.
Yeah, and the way that each product was developed was specifically engineered for the maximum availability and the ability for plants to actually metabolize these elements is really what we're kind of trying to chase. So like the CalMag that we make is a really good example. Everybody makes a CalMag. There's so many different CalMag products on the market, but ours is made unique by the fact that it's purely an organic acid based calcium and magnesium supplement. There's no nitrates, there's no phosphates, there's no sulfates, there's no chlorides, there's no carbonates, there's no animal byproducts. It's made with fermented orange peel and stevia leaf. And the fermented orange peels are just like really thick cell walls. If you really think about it, that outer rind of the orange itself is a really good defensive barrier. And it happens to be made up of these cross-linked pectic acid residues, these sugar complexes that when we ferment, we're capable of extracting them. Now, for all plants, or I should say for most of the plants that are out there, they make their cell walls by taking pectic acid and combining it with calcium anyways. That pectic acid is a reduced version of carbon, kind of going back one step. When the CO2 is in the air, plants take it out. That carbon may ultimately get funneled downstream into a building block for a cell wall. That's what a pectic acid residue basically is. But plants complex calcium ions with pectic acid residues to kind of reinforce the structural integrity of the cell walls. So if you have really thick cell walls, your plants become way more resistant to disease pressures, and they can handle swings in temperature and humidity with a greater extent than if they don't have a reinforced cell wall. So what we've done with the calcium chelate is we've fermented the orange peels to pull out those organic acid residues, complex them in with the calcium in a soluble form. That way, when your plants take them up, they take it up, and there's a 3/4 built cell wall component right there. And they say, oh, this is great. I would have otherwise had to do all this work where I use the power of the sun. I split water molecules. I generate a proton gradient that leads to ATP synthesis and NADPH, which is then used by the Calvin cycle. And then, 50, 60 steps later, you've got that pectic acid residue. So for us, it's a little shortcut where we can ferment the orange peel, get those necessary building blocks out, complex it with calcium, and then when the plants take it up, they're capable of converting that with no energy expenditure. They don't need to break anything down because there's nothing to break down. It's already been broken down for them. It's like rocket fuel for them effectively for their growth. And this is what I meant earlier when I said that not all forms of carbon are the same. You have biochar and you have humic substances. The purpose of those compounds is that they're supposed to hang out in the soil. They're not supposed to be fully dissolved and broken down and taken up by the plants. On the flip side, their benefits actually come primarily from them being trapped in the soil because they can do all these wonderful things like participate in chelation chemistry. They can, do water bridging. They can pull water, move it closer towards plants. They can chelate micronutrients. They can wrap themselves physically around heavy metals and prevent those heavy metals from being taken up by plants. And it all has to do with the specific structure of that carbon. They're very complex structures overall. What we're doing is entirely different. The type of carbon that we're working with is very low molecular weight. It's meant to go right inside the plant. It's meant to go at the core of all of the energy producing organelles within the plant. So the mitochondria and the chloroplasts, we're trying to feed carbon into them, not the outside soil. I mean, we do have, beneficial forms of carbon that build up in the soil. And to kind of piggyback what I was talking about earlier, to answer your question, Chris, the long-term benefits associated with using our carbon-based fertilizers are that the soil organic matter increases overall, and you get a much more broad range of beneficial microbes and beneficial fungi. So part of it is we're trying to build up the soil chemistry by doing things like working particular flavors of carbon in. These flavors of carbon are maybe more long chain and they resist degradation. They're there to kind of benefit the soil chemistry at large. But then on the flip side too, there's these very refined forms of rocket fuel that are meant specifically for the metabolic processes of the plant, and they get entered into the engines that otherwise burn the fuel as fast as it's capable of coming in. Synthase enzymes that are in trichome heads are a really good example. Terpene and cannabinoid synthase enzymes. Those will take substrates and act on them immediately. So if you have a substrate flow coming up to them, they'll just keep making stuff. They'll keep making all the terpenes and all the cannabinoids that are possible to make as long as they have the substrate available. And typically those substrate pools are very limited. Plants, that's like the holy grail for them. They start with a piece of charcoal or a lump of coal, which is basically your unrefined carbon, and then they try to refine that into the rocket fuel that can actually get injected into their motors. This is effectively the same analogy as why a lump of charcoal, you can't just put that into your car gas tank, right? You have to refine that in order to get that particular fraction of carbon out that can then be injected into your engine because it has the proper qualities, characteristics that might make it suitable for that. But just putting a lump of charcoal inside your gas tank isn't going to do anything for your car. And plants are the same way.
That makes sense. Makes sense. I'm sure a lot of us would have tried that by now with a quick visit to Home Depot or Home Hardware, whichever you have.
I'm going to
Grab
be
some
honest with you.
charcoal.
I've never had a guest on the show like sell me on stuff. I literally am filling my cart for a Build-A-Kit right now. With Stash Blend, I'm only going to need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of the 9.
Mhm.
So I'm going to give it a shot myself.
Yeah.
I'm going to try it out because I'm almost out of the current bottle-based newts that I have. And it's just easier for me at my other grow that's all automated to use something that's liquid. And it's nice.
Sorry, I'm really good at cutting people off.
I was just going to say, I'm going to use my discount code. Shout out also, Nick, for Rooted Leaf. We got a discount code for the audience, I believe.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. We're doing a little Black Friday sale. So it'll be 42% off, actually. And we'll try to.
And then our code, I'm going to use my code real quick. It's the stash, right?
Yeah, the stash, but it's not 42% off yet. Let me change it on the website real quick, and then we'll make it 42% off. I just set it at 20% off.
Oh, sweet. All right. So I'm going to wait.
Yeah.
I'm gonna wait. Wow, capitalize on that, guys. I'm kind of curious because we were talking organic, and I'm sure there's a proprietary element to this. But can you dive into it all? You mentioned it, the fermentation, but can you mention how you're extracting or getting carbon for your products?
Yeah, so the extraction of carbon comes partially from the fermentation chemistry, and obviously that includes the plants and the plants that we're working with. We do bring in whole plants. We're not buying like drums of somebody else's plant extract. We're not working with, a provider of ingredients. We're actually sourcing in some cases directly from the farming cooperatives themselves, because if our products are meant to promote and sustain regenerative agriculture, we also, on the flip side, on our sourcing, want to support that too. So we're trying to find farmers and cooperatives that are actually doing things right. Like the hibiscus flowers we use to make silica skin, those come directly from a farming cooperative that does not allow any machines to touch the land. There's no tractors. They go out, they hand harvest, they hand sort, they hand clean, and they hand pack everything so that when we get it sent to us, these hibiscus flowers they're whole and they're beautiful. You won't find higher quality hibiscus flowers anywhere in the world. It's all meant for human consumption, so it's all food grade and it's all pharmaceutical grade. But we take these plants and the microbes that we work with, and we take them through a fermentation process where we're capable of extracting the carbon-rich molecules and building a carbon-based fertilizer line out of that. And the carbon concentrations are quite high. And a lot of times it's the types of carbon that we're working with can kind of be split between two major categories. One would be that rocket fuel that I was talking about earlier. If you look at how plants actually make terpenes and how they actually make cannabinoids, they're shared substrate pools. We want to increase the pool of available substrate for them so they can make more because they've got more building blocks for it. And on the flip side, there's more complex forms that are not quite possible to inject directly inside of those engines. And those would be things like the humic substances, the more long chain forms of carbon that are really meant to contribute to long-term soil health and stability so that we can increase the chemical and physical properties of the soil. And it helps that we have several dozen species of plants that we're working with, because even in the most robust living soil, you may find a dozen or so components. You may find like alfalfa and some sea plants, like kelp meal, for example, in there. But you're not really going to find safflower pistils. You're not going to find hibiscus flowers. You're not going to find artichoke, moringa, jasmine, ginkgo, aloe, sage. You're not going to find any of these plants inside of a living soil. So again, the point is for us to introduce these compounds into the soil because it encourages a much broader and diverse expression in a range of microbes that you may not have unless you have those plant extracts that are facilitating the growth of those microbes and supporting the growth of those beneficial microbes. One good example I can give you actually is in our root anchor. Root anchor is made with fermented licorice root. Licorice root itself is known to be about 50 times sweeter than sugar, so it's very, very, very sugary, very sweet. But the compound that gives that characteristic sweetness is actually a saponin. And a lot of people are familiar with saponins. Those are the compounds that are a little bit soapy. They cause some foam. And if you look out in the landscape of what products out there contain saponins, you'll find yucca and quilaha are among the two more common ones that are used. Licorice roots also produce saponins, but they have a slightly different structure. And we learned, this actually took us a little bit of time, but we learned that the saponin inside of the licorice root extract that we put inside of root anchor is a very powerful stimulant for beneficial fungi. So if you feed that product into your soil, you're going to encourage whatever population of native fungi you have either floating in the air in your particular environment, or whatever you already have inside of your soil. So if you have Glomus species, if you have Trichoderma species, the populations of those will be able to take the licorice root extract and use that as a food source and a fuel source to grow. We actually used to put Glomus inside of Root Anchor. There's still a dozen strains of beneficial bacillus that are inside of there, but the Glomus, we noticed after several months of testing that we didn't actually have to have it anymore. We start off with one particular use rate, and we noticed this proliferation of beneficial fungi. So we said, okay, let's cut it back and see what that minimum dose is that we can put inside of the bottle to allow people to get the benefits. And we got to a spot where we eliminated the Glomus entirely, and there was no difference in the activities of the fungi that were observed. And I think it largely came down to the licorice root extract. There's something about licorice roots, that saponin that's present inside of that licorice root, that really encourages the growth of beneficial fungi. I mean, it causes an explosion of fungal activity, and I love seeing that in soils, especially in living soils.
Super, super interesting stuff. I do have a question for you that kind of navigates away from the nutrient line in particular. I just high level question, more for beginners, but I'm interested to understand what your approach would be. And this is a loaded question here because there's so many different ways to go about it. But okay, so of growers come across an issue with their plant, right? Let's say it's some form of yellowing. What would your recommended approach be for troubleshooting and potentially resolving that issue? I know it's a loaded question. There's so many different ways to go about it, but I want to know kind of your recommended way to go about it.
Yeah, I think the most important thing that any grower can do would be to first start gathering the appropriate kind of data. Don't worry about whether that data makes sense to you or not quite yet. Just focus on capturing it. You're going to start to realize there's things going on in the grow that maybe are easy to overlook, but once you actually start paying attention to them, you realize that they're just throttles that you can dial up or dial down and get different results from your plants. So if you walk into a garden and you see that your plants are yellowing, the first thing you should do is reference your data points. Say, okay, do I know my light intensity? Do I know my temperature? Do I know my humidity? Do I know the strength of the feed water? Do I know how much water I'm applying? Am I applying 5% of the total volume of the media, or am I applying 10%? Am I in rock wool, or am I in a peat and cocoa-based medium that's rich in biochar that's going to hold on to more of that moisture? These things are important because although they won't make sense for you immediately, over time, as you continue to pay attention to them, you'll start to realize I know what's going on here. The lights are maybe too intense. And if you back off that light intensity, that yellowing could actually correct itself and come back. On the flip side, there are instances where, let's say all this stuff to be true and you think to yourself, my lights aren't that intense, and maybe at 300 to 400 ppfd, the observation that I'm noticing in the plant isn't quite what I would expect from high light intensity. So let me take a look at something else. And then you take a look at your nutrient strength and realize, I thought I watered an EC of 2.0, but instead I watered an EC of 1.0. So in that kind of context, you might be capable of determining there is in fact a nutrient deficiency. In most cases, it's going to be related to nitrogen or magnesium. Sometimes it's related to iron. There are other instances where what appears to be a nutrient imbalance, perhaps a deficiency or a toxicity, could very likely revolve around over or undering water. Overwatering or underwatering. And I see this happen 99 times out of 100, where a lot of the outward manifestations of plants that people observe are actually a result of something to do with incorrect watering. A little bit too much water, not enough water, a little bit too dry in the soil, created hydrophobic pockets, made it difficult to saturate those roots again. The plants will show visual signs of being stressed. And if you focus through the narrow lens of just looking at deficiencies, you'll overlook the more important thing of light intensity, airflow, humidity, temperature, water, saturation in the roots, things like that. Nutrients do factor in, but in the grand scheme of things, they may not be as important as some of the other variables. So yeah, those are some of the things that I would say to consider. And then from there, you learn how to play with the individual variables. If you know what to expect when you feed your plants a stronger feed water solution, and you have higher light intensity, and you have higher concentrations of CO2, you can then know to make the adjustment just on how strong you're feeding your plants. I know my plants need more fertilizer because I just cranked up the CO2 and I just cranked up the light intensity. It's very natural based on my experiences to understand the plants will have a higher appetite for food if you give them more spark and you give them more air. They're going to need more fuel so that they can make more horsepower. Otherwise, without enough of that fuel, your engine's going to run dry. And that's where you start to get some burning effects that happen both in a car engine and inside of the engine that is a plant. Hopefully that answered the question.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think a lot of growers will go right to getting an EC or ppm measurement and then getting a pH measurement. And it's cool to hear that you've got several other things that you can potentially look at that I think a lot of like newer growers aren't really thinking about to check. They just go right to those measurements that we hear drilled into our brains so much as we begin growing. And, those certainly have important impacts on it. And then some folks will resort right to flushing. So flushing, are you a proponent of it? Do you feel like measuring and seeing that there's too much nutrients in it, flush is necessary? Some people will say, oh, no, okay, just do water only for the next couple feeds. Like, what's kind of your stance on flushing? When would you flush if you flush?
Yeah, and going back to the data points, it's important if you're in this process to take measurements of the runoff if you can, if you're in a living soil or a peat and perlite kind of mix, and your lights aren't that intense. You want to try to avoid runoff. You want to just get the pots to saturation. So this is where people will water maybe 5% of the total pot size rather than something like 10%. So if you have a 5-gallon pot that you're growing in, 10% of that would be half a gallon, right? And then 5% of that is a quarter of a gallon. And a quarter of a gallon is approximately 1,000 milliliters. So you can kind of do some basic math and say, well, this is kind of the target range. But if you're in rock wool, for example, or a media that tends to dry out really quickly and go through wet dry cycles very rapidly, you may actually be closer to 10 to 20% runoff. The additional runoff will allow you to push more of that nutrition through, whereas less runoff encourages the nutrition to stay in the soil. And depending on the dynamics of those nutrients, if they're purely salt-based, what they're going to do is start to break down some of the organic matter in the soil. They start to attack the very things that are meant to hold the soil structure in place and allow for the transfer of nutrients to occur. Because if you have nutrients inside of a feed water solution, you put that feed water solution into the soil is really the transmission between the feed water to the plants, right? You want to get that water worked into the plants. The medium, that you have to go through is the soil. So it's important to understand what's happening in the soil. If the soil chemistry is such that it's promoting the buildup of nutrients, it may be a good idea to flush with either plain water or put a little bit of mild acidic solution in there. Most of the minerals that build up in soils are actually capable of being dislodged with using vinegar rather than using something like phosphoric acid as a pH down. So if you have tap water, maybe that tap water comes out like 7.2 pH or something. It's always a good idea to add a little bit of vinegar and introduce a mildly acidic solution into the soil, particularly in instances where you have nutrient buildup, because those acids are capable of chemically weathering or breaking down some of those built up forms of nutrition. The other thing to consider too is that when salt formation happens in the soil, oftentimes those salts are not highly soluble in water. So it doesn't matter how much plain water you push through the medium, because if it's not soluble, it won't dissolve and it won't move. It'll just kind of hang out there as the water flows past this little this little crystal, this little salt crystal. It won't pick up that salt crystal and move it. In fact, it'll just remain there. So this is why it's important to kind of pay attention to what exactly is going on. If you progressively experience a buildup of EC in the rhizosphere in the soil, and you notice that the plants are being adversely affected by it, doing a plain water flush with a little bit of vinegar to help bring the acidity down, or bring the pH down a little bit and get that acidity up a little bit, that's really one of the better things that you can do.
That's a great tip. Yeah, I can only imagine people just waterlogging their plant, just water torture. It's nothing. They're just like, oh, well, let's go. And it's like, no, you have a diamond in your soil, unfortunately, bud.
I used to do it all the time, man. You think that flushing is just going to solve all the problems, but
that's the rule of thumb. Like, I feel like with growing, there's so many variables, man. That's why I always equate it to jujitsu. It's a lot of things just because it's like changed my mentality, but there's no one way. There's no guarantee that this is it. It's all situational. It's all dependent on how you approach it and what you've done leading up to it, and all the moves leading up to that one position. It's crazy, man.
And to kind of, as a further extension of some of the benefits of a carbon-based fertilizer program, it's important to note that certain forms of carbon can actually increase the availability of nutrients in particular pH ranges. So like with our feed water, it's not uncommon if someone is running an RO system to mix up a batch of feed water and the pH is about 4.5. Now, most people would look at that and be like, well, no, that's too low. I can't water a pH of 4.5 to the plants. And I specifically recommend do not adjust the pH. Water that into the plants 100%. They will not burn. They don't burn because the flavor of carbon that's there allows those minerals to behave fundamentally different. You can go online and go on Google and look up charts that show the availability of certain minerals at particular pH ranges. And that can be a little bit misleading because those charts represent the perspective of that nutritional element as it exists rather than that nutritional element as it interacts with everything else around it. This is the concept of a chelating agent. You can have a chelating agent make a chelate, and then that chelate effectively protects the charge on a mineral that might otherwise bind up or get tied up or locked out in the soil somehow. And those adverse interactions are what people want to avoid when they're looking at the pH ranges and the availability of those minerals. In reality, it's a very complex topic, but I can tell you that watering a pH as low as 4.0 to 4.3 is perfectly safe with our products. It would not be the same with salt-based or conventional fertilizers because they have no carbon. There's no buffer. There's no capacity for those nutrients to resist being tied up with other elements. And that's why it's very important to have this narrow pH range. You got to have it at 5.8 because 5.6 will burn the plants and 6.0 will also damage the plants. So like you spend this very long time adjusting the pH. Whereas with our products, like we have, 30,000 square foot cultivation facilities that threw away their pH meters. That just doesn't matter anymore. You can water the plants with whatever the pH is as it naturally comes out because that pH isn't really relevant anymore. We have reduced carbon in the mix, and that reduced carbon fundamentally changes the dynamics. pH is now second fiddle. It's no longer the primary aspect of the nutrients that's important to consider.
So interesting. We just were talking about that in a recent episode.
Did an episode of that,
and this adds a whole new layer
to add that right in there.
Well, this is where we were just saying science evolves, and as more people like yourself who have conventional chemistry knowledge are coming into this space, and you're helping change things up. Just like when you see other LED manufacturers having more efficacy with their lights, it's because they have traditional experience. They're not just kind of. It's good to have the grassroots side, trust me, but at the same time, we need more people who have the science-based minds, like George Murray, who we work with for Stash Blend, is people who can bring a traditional science to what we know we want the plant to have. And they're like, well, here's alternative methods that actually would be more efficient and could do better. And like, wow, for years, I've just been throwing HID lighting and salt and tons of water and big pots and all these crazy things at my plants. Turns out I can have small plants, high fertigation, carbon-based nutrients, pH isn't as big of an issue, LED lights. Like it's crazy how much further cultivation has come. Mm-hmm. So big kudos to yourself and brands like you who are doing it, man.
Think where we'll be in like 5 years from now. I'm not even going to say 10. Just think of where we'll be in 5 years from now. I think it's going to be pretty remarkable.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So where can people can find yourself and your brand so we can keep up with what you're doing? Do you have social media that you're active on?
Yeah. Check us out on Instagram, The Rooted Leaf. And if you guys send us a message, I'm the one that typically responds to them. So feel free to ask any questions you guys have. I love to interact with people. And then check out our website, rootedleaf.com. We've got a bunch of great information about all the products, our approach, our philosophies. You can kind of take a look at which plants go into which products. And, I always like talking about the dovetailing between the plants that we work with and the benefits that they might be able to bring into, cultivation of any plant in any kind of garden.
Absolutely.
That was really good. A general conversation of everything as a whole. And I would encourage people to go check out Mr. Growitz's episode with Nick in it as well, because there's even a little more focused when it comes to the CO2.
Maybe we could link it in a card on YouTube over here in the description for this one, because that's to add on to the conversation, man. There's layers.
We could totally do a part 2 on this one. So Nick, I want to thank you for coming in. That was an incredibly eye-opening conversation. I know, in fact, there could be a part 2 because there's so many questions about so much of what you went into, including the kombucha.
Yeah. Big thanks also, man, for supplying our audience with a discount code. We've had people on before who have products and we didn't think to get that. So really appreciate you hooking it up. It's the Stash. If you go to, I'm over here reading the whole website, so I'm getting distracted. I had it on my phone first, and I was like, I can't read. Get it bigger. Rootedleaf.com and use discount code the Stash. And then currently there's a sale going on, I believe, if you listened to this when it first came out. But yeah, I'm ordering it myself, man. With the discount code, it's like $90 for what I need. That's great.
Yeah. And I hope to be able to support people regardless of what they're doing. If they take the full living soil and they want to use just organics, we can help build out a program. It's all fully modular and customizable. We've got some products in our product line because those represent the best ways to get that individual element across to the actual plants themselves. So it's a very good way to kind of take a very precise and refined tool. If you've already got good stuff going on in your soil, you may just need 1 or 2 products. The foliar sprays work wonderfully well. But then on the flip side too, if you're just in an inert media, rock wool, trying to do crop steering, we can build out a full program that takes advantage of every single macro and micronutrient and delivers it to the plants in the best possible way. So it's fully modular, fully scalable, and it can, help anybody who's growing anything.
Oh, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm talking about. Someone who's going to help someone dial in their game. Nick, that was awesome conversation, guys. If you have anything you want to add to the comment section, I encourage you guys to do so. You know who we are. That was Nick from the Rooted Leaf. Did I get that correct? The Rooted Leaf?
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Thank you guys
Rooted
so
Leaf
much
Agritech.
for tuning in. And we'll see you guys on the next one.
See you later.
Take care.